Welcome to the Historical Romance Sampler Podcast. I'm your host, Katherine Grant, and each week I introduce you to another amazing historical romance author. My guest reads a little sample of their work, and then we move into a free-ranging interview. If you like these episodes, don't forget to subscribe to the Historical Romance Sampler wherever you listen to podcasts, and follow us on Instagram, TikTok, and YouTube. Now, let's get into this week's episode. All right, I am super excited to be joined today by Annabelle Anders. Annabelle began publishing books in 2017 and left her day job a year later. Since then, she has published over 40 full-length Regency romance novels, with one of them receiving the distinguished RITA nomination in 2019. She also wrote a novella in our collaborative series, The Scandals and Scoundrels of Drury Lane. Annabelle writes at her home in the small town of Grand Junction, Colorado, with the help of her two miniature dachshunds and husband of 30 years. She is happy to have finally found her place in life as a writer. Annabelle, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I'm really excited to get to sit down and pick your brain.
What's left of it these days?
So you're reading for us from Hell's Bell. What do we need to know before we jump into the scene?
So while I was writing this book, my glasses kept breaking and it made its way into the story. And so my hero she is the ultimate blue stocking. And my hero is one of the biggest man whores I've ever written. So they're driving out to a house party. He had to climb in the carriage because it started raining, and they've arrived at the estate and everybody's climbing out of the carriage. And so that's where this scene is going to start at.
Awesome.
Okay. As the doorway cleared, he gestured to Miss Goodnight to precede him. Her brown eyes flew wide open, as though she'd not expected gallantry. Even with the blasted spectacles, he noticed her eyes now. She rose, crouched over, and edged sideways to make her way past him. Just as she did so, the carriage jostled, and with nothing to grasp to regain her balance, she tumbled onto his lap, dropping her bag onto the floor. My apologies, my lord, her breath fanned against his throat as she gasped her regrets. Despite all her bristle and intellectual outrage, she was still a woman. Marcus couldn't possibly ignore this fact with her squirming around on his lap. Soft bum, tiny waist, he'd not considered before what she hid beneath her petticoats and drab dresses. For one outrageous second, he imagined what her thighs would feel like wrapped around his waist. The tender skin between a lady's legs never failed to arouse him. When she pulled back to peer up at him, Marcus had to blink himself back to reality. Except one of her eyes looked perfectly normal, but the other was hugely magnified behind the remaining lens. The glass had fallen out again. A little freakish, to be sure, but she also appeared adorably confused and more than a little lost. Marcus couldn't help but laugh. Her face scrunched into a scowl, drawing even more hilarity from him. Lord Blakely, I'm glad you find my handicap so amusing. She turned her attention to his shirt front, lowering her face closer to it, and her curious hands began searching his person. It must be here somewhere. It took him another moment to realize she wasn't so suddenly overcome with his masculine assets so much as to fondle him, but that she was searching frantically for her lens. Tiny fingers explored down his sternum, past the waist of his breeches. Good God, did the woman not know what she was doing? She dropped to the floor and now kneeled before him, her fingers probing still. His thighs, around his lap, the seat. Hold still, woman, he finally ground out, and then crunch. Oh no, she froze. Apparently she'd forgotten all manners, all sense of social boundaries, as one of her hands rested on his no longer, well, uninterested. It's moving. Ah, yes, Marcus wasn't sure whether he ought to cover his face in mortification or turn the chit over his knees for a good spanking. Your mentula. My what? It's Latin, she mumbled, but hadn't yet withdrawn her hand. In fact, she appeared somewhat mesmerized, as though she'd like to investigate further. A swim in a frozen lake, vomit, an unemptied chamber pot. It took all of Marcus's imagination in order to conjure images so that he could bring himself under control. You, his voice came out, sounding strained nonetheless. You crushed your lens. Have a care not to cut yourself. Gripping her elbow, he lifted her ever so carefully from the floor. That dazed look on her face finally twisted into horror. Marcus ignored it. Instead, he bent over and retrieved what was left of the lens, all 7 pieces of it. I'm afraid you'll have to locate that other pair, Miss Goodnight. This one's quite beyond repair. She'd begun scrambling around, collecting the books that had spilled from her bag. Mostly romantic drivel, he saw, except for hell's bells. Did her mother know the extent of this hoyden's reading? The memoirs of a woman of pleasure? He could not quite make out the author before she hastily stuffed it into the worn but sturdy bag. Can you see to walk with only one lens? She seemed disoriented, but he wasn't sure if it was from her unanticipated examination of his mentula or her impaired vision. I'm fine, quite fine. She refused to look in his direction, choosing instead to feel around the door in order to climb out. When she did so, the sunlight reflected off the remaining lens in her spectacles and nearly blinded him. The sensation reminded him of when one of the boys at Eton had used a magnifying glass to torture insects. Marcus blinked and then, afraid she'd tumble to the pavement below, grasped her by the waist until he was certain she'd exited safely.
That is a lovely, spicy tension scene for us to want to know what happens when they get to the end of that carriage ride.
I it's funny how things from your life will make it into the books. And it was one of those times I seriously kept having a lens fall out of my glasses and my husband kept fixing it. So it's kind of one of the themes is his caring about her having glasses. Like that's one thing I like when you take a bad boy and you have him doing something that's just really caring that you wouldn't expect. So Marcus is always will be one of my favorite characters, and Miss Emily Goodnight is definitely one of my favorite characters too, because they're both so far on their spectrum of blue stocking and rake. So
Yeah,
it's
to bring
fun.
them together is fun.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Well, I've got a lot of questions and more to talk about with you, but first we're going to take a quick break for our sponsors.
London, 1820. Amelia's hat shop in Chelsea, her dream, her life. A spark from a bonfire and all is ashes. Nothing left but one woman who's sick of lies. One man who's lying for love. One night, it's all they've got. Is it enough? The Chelsea Milliner from Annie R. McEwen, available everywhere.
The Historical Romance Sampler Podcast is a proud affiliate of Libro.fm. Libro.fm is a really cool audiobook retailer that offers the same selection of audiobooks at the same price that you would find at that other really big audiobook retailer. But instead of sending your money to a giant monopoly, your money with your purchase of Libro.fm audiobooks goes back to the local bookstore of your choice. That way you can purchase audiobooks but still support your local literary community. Also cool is their Kiss Club, which features romance audiobooks on sale every month. If you're ready to sign up for Libro.fm, I've got a good deal for you. Using the code HISTORICAL, as in Historical Romance Sampler, sign up for a new membership and get 3 audiobooks for the price of 1. Check out the link in my show notes if you want more information. And now, back to the episode. I am back with Annabelle Anders, who just read a sample from Hell's Bells, her RITA-nominated novel. So one of the things that you mentioned before reading and also after is that Marcus is, I think the word you used was man whore.
Yes.
Do you find yourself attracted to specific types of characters, or is he one of the only man whores that you've written? How do you think about that when you're going to think about your
It's evolved
work?
for me, definitely depending on the trope and as I change as a person. So I realize now, even though he's a bit of a man whore, I think so many of my heroes are really marshmallow heroes.
Mm.
I try to write the alpha holes and I just can't do it because I can't. I know that that is a thing that so many people like, but I just remember reading the old Harlequin romances, and of course they were all single POV, so you never knew these guys, and these guys seemed so mean and cold. And I mean, in some ways it was very romantic, but I got really tired of it at a young age.
Mhm.
So one thing that is kind of an interesting thing I think about this book, but about Marcus in particular, is in the first couple chapters of the book, my heroine watches him with a widow. She watches how he functions in a ballroom, and then of course she goes and hides in the library. And then he and the widow show up in that library, and I describe her watching him. And my first editor had come to me, and she used to work for Trad Publishing, and she said, "You can't have this scene in this book. It's a romance. You cannot have him with another woman." And I was like, "Oh my God, but that's what the whole story is based on." And I had written the whole book, and I had a different friend who was doing indie publishing, and I'm all indie now. And she said, "Anne, you're writing an indie book. You write it however you want." That was pretty
Mm-hmm.
freeing for me. And so, yeah, so, that sometimes, it's one thing I like to try to get in my book is some sort of scene that you just won't find in other scenes. I like the characters where they might be saying one thing, but they're doing nice, sweet, loving things kind of in the background, or, it kind of comes out eventually. So,
Right. They're almost lying to themselves and their actions are telling them.
yes, yes, they gotta be cool.
Yeah. Well, so you mentioned that you used to read Harlequins. Who are some of the authors that have most influenced your writing or your career?
I never would be a writer if I weren't a reader first. And definitely that would be Judy Blume when I was like a kid. And I don't know if you've watched the documentary of
Mm-mm.
her life as an artist. Every author retreat I go to, I force the whole group to watch Judy Blume. If you get a chance to watch that documentary, it's just like just how much she affected people. But anyway, that pulled me into reading initially. And then I read contemporary for a long time, and my mom gave me a Mary Bellog book for Christmas, probably around like 2010, 2011. And I read Mary Bellog's entire backlist. I love her style of writing. And so much so that when I wrote my first book, I submitted it to publishers because that's what you were supposed to do at that point. The editor sent it back to me, and I had totally written it in Mary Bellog style. There's like a past sort of thing she gets going on. And she's like, "You can't do this." And I was like, "Oh," I was like, "I guess I'm not Mary Bellog." But definitely she pulled me in. And then, Lisa Kleypas and some Julianne Long, What I Did for a Duke. There's like a scene in that book that if you ever haven't read that book, it's just got this one scene that if you read it, you'll know what you would know. It's just so there's these nuances, I think, that are so key in historical romance where they're saying things and they're doing different things. And I'm trying to lean into that. It's tricky to try and, when you're trying to produce a lot of books really fast, but I've kind of tried to slow down a little bit and lean into that sort of thing a little bit more.
Yeah. So speaking of, you have published 40 full novels plus novellas, I know, since 2017, and we're recording in 2024. So that's 7 years. So how do you stay inspired and curious enough to keep coming back to the page?
Well, I have to be reading. Ironically, I have a really hard time reading historical since I've been writing historical so long. I think it's my imposter syndrome where I'm just like, oh, and I don't want to be using other people's ideas. Even though it shows up unintentionally. You'll be reading a book, and there's only so many scenarios you can have in historical. And I find like that I don't want to avoid a scenario because I've read it in somebody else's. So I read a lot of contemporary, but I have to be reading in order to be writing. I find if I get into a reading funk, it's harder for me to write. And I have to say, I wrote more in the beginning. I'd actually written 3 or 4 books before I got published. And when I bartended at the same time, I was bartending at a hotel here in town. And what was interesting about that was writing was my fun thing. It was my side thing. And I would be driving to work thinking about my story. I'd be waiting on people, writing down ideas about my story in slow times. And so when I quit, I had to really make an adjustment because then suddenly writing is work. And that has been a struggle. And so I say I try to get my motivation from reading just other contemporary stories. And then I went to England in May, which was very inspiring. I have to say, of all the books I've written set in England, I had been to England when I was 17 for about 12 hours. It was like a stopover. So I really didn't know what England felt like. I went with Nicole Locke and Deb Marlowe, and Virginia Heath showed us around, which was just magnificent.
Amazing.
She showed us around we took us all around the Cotswolds and Bath, and we met up with Kate Bateman, and it's just so, and a couple other authors over there. It was amazing. And I came back, I was so inspired. I spent a week in Cornwall. So I had to put Cornwall in my book that I released after I got home. But it's been harder. I mean, I'll be honest, like going through hitting menopause as a person with ADHD, the last couple of years have been really, really rough to just
Mm.
try to stay creative and keep producing, especially as I'm doing it as a living. But finally feeling like, and I'd gotten COVID a few times, and there's like a COVID fog, but it's kind of crazy. Like one hand is like the waitressing was great because I got all my footsteps in. I was like moving around all the time, but I hated having to work for someone else.
Yeah.
But writing is ultimately it's a job when we do it, and you have to figure out ways to keep everything functioning properly. So,
Absolutely. Yeah, no. And something that stands out to me is I've spoken to some other authors who have also written, dozens and dozens of books, but most of them have actually written different eras or genres. And yours are 40 Regency romances, a lot like Mary Balog. What is it about the Regency era that keeps you, or are there other genres or other eras that you're interested in exploring and you just haven't yet?
well, one thing I've totally slowly moved into the 1830s. So
Okay.
some people would arguably say but I feel like I'm kind of still in like, so their clothing has changed a little bit. I think it
Yeah.
will be fun. Eventually, I probably will hit the Victorian age and get some trains going in there, a little more industry. But part of it too was I like I can switch from Victorian to Regency really easy as a reader, but I generally, if I'm not reading contemporary, I want to just read Regency. I don't know if that's my generation or what. I have a hard time switching to like Edwardian or medieval. I don't know what it is. I love the Regency. I don't know. Maybe it is just I'm so steep. I literally read so many Mary Bellogs books over and over again.
Yeah.
I don't know what it was about her. It's a hard time in my life, and so it was a very comfort escape for me. So I'm very attached to that, I think. But also, I don't want to jump around to a lot of different genres because I want my readers to kind of know what to expect when they're going to pick up one of my books. It's going to be set between 1815 and 1834, depending on when I wrote it. So,
Yeah. Yeah. I also got hooked into historical romance by Mary Balog.
did you?
And yes, and there are two elements of her writing that I think really worked for me. One is, for the most part, maybe not including her earliest stuff, but the stuff that I was reading,
Mhm.
it's good people trying to do good things. Usually they're trying to honor their family in the best way possible. And the conflict is which thing honors my family without making me unhappy.
Right,
And then
right.
it's also got this quality of like quiet moments rather than big crazy things happening. Like it's most likely that they're just going to have a dinner and
Yeah,
maybe in the wildest one someone gets kidnapped, but for the most part it's just like people living their little lives and
definitely. I
trying to do
definitely
well
like her
by each
later ones.
other.
There is a man, she's got some of those earlier Signet romances. They have some plots that it's just like, I'm like, oh my God. I can't, it's like, I don't know when those must have been written in the early 80s, but yeah, I'm with you on there's a very quiet, a very slow burn aspect. And I'm definitely turning into very much a slow burn author myself. I have a few books where it jumps right into the sexy sexies, and I always will try to have spicy scenes in my books, but definitely slow burn has become more of a signature of mine, I'd say, in the last couple of years. So
Yeah.
I like the slow burn aspect at Mary Bale. Except for there's that one book where it starts where they're walking through the park and there's a storm and she hates the guy she's walking with, and they end up taking refuge in a like a little, what are they called? Little,
Folly or something.
yeah. And to calm her down, of course, he has sex with her. So, but like then they don't talk to each other for like the next 70% of the book. It's like, but it's no, it's very, yeah, I like that. Just, yeah. So it could go either way as far as spicy
Yeah.
stuff. So,
Yeah. And when you think about these 40 books that you've written, do you feel that you can identify any common themes or questions or signatures that you have in your work?
Definitely. My best books always come back to the idea that the heroine thinks she's not good enough. And I have a few books where I've written where they're more confident heroines, but I've never been a super confident person as far as a flirt or, comfortable around like men and stuff like that to where I have confidence in myself. And so the idea that as I like to take it's part of it is the hero falling in love with her. And part of that is what gives her the confidence. But a lot of it, I feel like she has to find that confidence from inside of herself. And so that's kind of, there's a song by Alanis Morissette,
Oh,
and it's called That I Would Be Good. It's just
okay.
like that I would be good even if I did nothing, that I would be good even if I got the thumbs down. I mean, it's just like if I were sick, if I gained 10 pounds, the whole notion of that, like the heroine is good enough, but everyone's told her her whole life, made her think she's not good enough. And
Yeah.
so the hero is a big part of it, but she has to realize it herself as well. So actually, my current reading binge is women's fiction.
Yeah. Yeah. That's really interesting. And so you said that actually you read a lot of contemporary romance, then you got hooked into Mary. But when you decided to start writing historical romance, what drew you to writing historical?
So I'm a person who likes baths. And I would be sitting in the bathtub and I'd be thinking, there's so many books cover the exact same thing, it feels like over and over again. And I would think of different storylines that I would want to do and have something a little different happen in them. And I was like, what if you took, and this is part of where I get from like contemporary sometimes, a contemporary twist, but you throw it at a historical character and you have them get there. And then when you research it, you find out it very much was a thing. One of my books called The Perfect Debutante is a book about the heroine is a cutter. And people tend to either love this book or hate it. But, I had a personal experience with it from a member of my family, and I had to learn about it. And, the more I learned about it, I was like, oh, I've got to have a heroine this way. And so I kind of addressed it and, so there's things that seem like they're very modern things, but they go back. If you go back and you actually research it, now very much, we're humans. So a lot of this stuff is just happening over and over again.
Yeah, yeah. And so I, on a more fun research note, I heard the in your scene she has the Latin word mentula, and I was like, okay, so that means you had to look up
Oh, yeah.
what did they call it in Latin. So tell me more about your research process in general for your books.
My research process. So it's really changed because I have always been a pantser. And I think when I had time to really meditate on every story more, I was able to keep. And so my research ends up being I will get to a certain problem or a certain event in one of my books and think, oh, I need to see if this is even a thing. And then I fall down a rabbit hole. And there's been times where it kind of will direct so much of what ends up happening in that story. But I like to first think about how the hero and heroine are going to meet. I'm big on having them meet in the first chapter because I don't like to wait several chapters to see the characters together. So I'm not a very patient person. Although I have to say, in like one of Mary Balog's last series, she had so much backstory in the first like 40 pages, and I was reading it and I was thinking, only she can get away with this because I trust her. And I kept reading, and there was and you know which one I'm talking about. It's her most
Yeah.
recent series.
Yeah, yeah.
And I kept reading it. And at the end of that 40 or 50 pages that I read, I realized that she'd set up that entire series with all
Yeah.
that backstory. But I had to trust her to get through it. Because normally I would not trust a book that I started reading that had them apart that long. But so
Yeah.
yeah, so generally I do a meet cute and then I have an idea. I had been thinking more in terms of tropes after I wrote my first series because my first series was no tropes at all. I wrote not knowing what you're supposed to be doing as a writer, which is a great thing. I think it's a great thing because then I learned that that's really hard to market in Like people really like tropes, but what when you don't have a trope in your book? Like you just came up with something wild. And those books are some of my funnest books. But as I started writing more, I did kind of lean more into tropes. So I have tropes, I'll have ideas of how to go about the tropes. I did kind of my last couple series of kind of have overarching threads, kind of mysteries, and which is fun, but harder to write and be leaning into your tropes and the romances as much. So I definitely plan from 2025. I'm going to be more as far as just family connections if they're in a series, so that I can lean more into the relationship, more lean into the character's growth. And that's a part of just me as a person changing the way I look at it. So it really is kind of amazing how much, and that's why any author that I read, kind of, I like to try to read their first books first and then kind of see where they go as they've grown. I am a binger. When I find an author that I like, man, I'll just
Yeah.
read all of them. So,
Yeah. No, I agree. As much as we are writing as part of our living, it is also like we're compelled to write, not because it's such a lucrative business, but because it is, part of the way that we exist in the world and make sense of the world. And so naturally, the way that we orient towards the writing and the way that we use the writing and the way that we need to write changes as we change.
right. I mean, you have to feel it. That's the whole thing. And I mean, I even, like even like writing the tropes and like I put out a ton of books, I think it was in 2020, where I totally burned myself out, man. And I've just tried to go back to where I'm trying to lean into each book. I'm not setting myself such fast deadlines and just trying to lean into each scene and enjoy each scene more when you're just kind of trying to write. I feel like sometimes, I go back and I'm like, oh, still, it's what I wanted to write. But sometimes I'm just like, I'm not feeling it as much, and I want to feel it more for my own sanity.
Yes.
I don't know if
Yeah.
that makes any sense.
That makes total sense to me.
So,
Yeah. Well, I think it's a good time to move to our game, Love It
okay,
or Leave It.
okay,
Love it or leave it. We kind of already know the answer to this one, but I'll ask you. Love it or leave it. Protagonists meet in the first 10% of the novel.
definitely, definitely, yep, love it.
Uh, love it or leave it. Dual point of view narration.
Yes, love it. Love it. I love to read, but I gotta say, since I've been reading these women's fiction books so much, those are single POV. I think it's harder to stay in single POV as a writer because sometimes you want to get something across. It's a lot easier if you jump to the other male, female POV, which also part of the reason I like that. Like initially, I read all those Harlequins where you never knew what the guy was thinking until the last 3 pages of the book, where he finally admits that he loves her. I really want to see that relationship more. I think you see it more from both sides, especially in straight up romance when you have dual POV. So, love dual POV.
Yeah. All right. Love it or leave it. Third person past tense.
I think historical has to be third person past tense. I, as a contemporary reader, really tossed around the idea of doing first person. I've written some first person contemporary novellas that were past or present tense. And the hard thing is when you go back to third, it's really hard to stay in one of them. But I feel like with historical, the way we're setting up the world, especially in Regency, there's a formality to it. And I don't know, like about younger readers, if they would be more open to the first person. I do feel like having written some and reading a lot in first person, it causes me to get a deeper third person. Like I do
Mm.
want to have a deeper third person past tense POV. And I, I like, just really trying to still make the reader feel like they're in my heroine's brain.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. All right. Love it or leave it. Third act breakup or dark moment.
Hmm. I think in historical, you kind of got to love it. I know there's a lot of contemporary books out there that are kind of abandoning that. I've had some that are close to not having the black moment. I hate when the moment, it cannot just be a misunderstanding because it drives me bonkers. My sense of reality cannot withstand that. But I do like to have something that pulls them apart, and then they both have to make a strong decision to be back together. And that kind of completes their character growth to that point. But yeah, so for me, I have to say love it.
All right. Love it or leave it. Always end with an epilogue.
I know readers love it. And when I don't do it, I get in trouble. I When I read a book, once the characters get together, I kind of lose interest. So I'm so bad. I'm so bad, but I know that before too, when I was just reading books and not writing them, I don't know if it's my ADHD that got worse or what it is, but I did like to see them together. And so I have to go back to that time of when I liked that because I really think readers really want epilogues. And when I've added bonus epilogues, readers really love those. So I really try to do that and just put myself back in that. It's funny because yeah, when I read though, I'm like, oh, they're together. Figured that one out. I'm done.
That is funny. All right. Love it or leave it. Always share research in your author's note.
I only share something like that if I have defied what research tells me. Like I know I think I had might have been Silent Night in a Christmas novella I did once, and I was like, nope, I realized this was not a thing at that point, but for such and such a purposes. I did have a trigger warning in the book about the cutting because I don't that could actually harm the reader. I That's the only time I've ever done a trigger warning is because I understand that if people read about it, it can actually trigger them into cutting again. So, but yeah, I not many author notes for me, honestly. I do the research, but I get so caught up in the the characters, their motivation that I think that's I don't know. I find things out in the research that I think are interesting. I don't know. I just kind of I get antsy. I'm kind of just getting it out there, getting it out there, getting it out there. But certain things, yeah, I've done a few.
Yeah, no, I understand. It's actually a lot of work to keep track of all of your research and then write it up in a way that people will understand and then get it into an author's note in a short enough format so that it won't be another novel. And then like by the time that you're writing the author's note, you're like, I just need to get this to my advanced reviewers.
Right.
Okay, well, and are there any romance rules I didn't ask you about that you do like to break or
Romance.
push the envelope on?
I think my characters, I cannot glorify the way that the dukes and stuff, the way they were making their money, the imperialism. And so I always like to have my good guys are like they're trying to figure a different way to make money so that they can make sure that they're good landlords so that their tenants are safe. And I cannot justify in my mind glorifying a bad guy. So
Mm-hmm.
that would be the rule that I do break. And of course, then my heroines, they're really spunky, so they'll do all sorts of things. And it's interesting. I think there's times where you can be a little more subtle with it. Mary Baylog, I think, was really good at being later in her books where the heroines had this agency. And she gave them a very subtle form of agency. And I think that's the trick with historical. You want to give your heroines agency, but it can't be too in your face. So,
Right.
unless they're kidnapped, of course, and they're just off by the beach somewhere.
Right,
So,
right. No, absolutely. Well,
but
okay, can you tell us where listeners can find you and your books and what book they should be looking for?
I'll be finishing up. It's the Rakes of Rotten Row, which is a 6-book series. And my recent release of that was the Bond Street Bachelor, which has got scenes set in Cornwall, where I pulled from my trip to Cornwall. Oh, I love Cornwall. Anyway, and so they're all standalones, and those books are available wide right now, so you can find them on Barnes and Noble, Kobo, Amazon. And if you go through, you can read all the books in the series now, and then you could just be just caught up by the time Regent Street Road releases in January, which will wrap that series up for me. So
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. This has been really lovely to chat with you. I appreciate you coming on.
thank you, Catherine. I really appreciate it. It's been a pleasure.
That's it for this week. Don't forget to subscribe to the Historical Romance Sampler wherever you listen, and follow us on Instagram, TikTok, and YouTube. Until next week, happy reading!